Round two. Keep getting interrupted. Anyway, let's try this again. The Nephilim of Genesis 6. This is a highly misunderstood topic, and I'm just going to explain what it is I've come to understand and where it comes from and my reasoning. And the reasoning of my pastor, honestly, this is not something that I've come up with on my own. That being said, the Nephilim are described as sons of God coming down to the earth, and they go into the daughters of men. It's kind of crude, but I mean, think of it as a lot of people have assumed that there was some sort of like legitimate, like humanly sexual act, I don't know what else to say, between the angels and the daughters, and that it perhaps wasn't willful. But here's the thing: Satan has to function within God's requirement of free will. So in other words, the women would have had to make a choice in the affirmative, which means they had to have had these notions proffered to them as a choice, as an option. So it wasn't just a takeover. It wasn't just a slavery of sorts where the women didn't have a choice. They actually actively wanted their sons to be, supermen, for lack of a better way to put it. So Nephilim of Genesis 6 is a genetic experiment. The reason why I am convinced of this, my pastor and a few other people's, is because we have no other real explanation for dinosaurs, for example. I've grown up hearing in the church that the earth is only 6,000 years old, dinosaurs existed with David, yada yada. But even though I don't trust science because it's not trustworthy, there is some notion that science brings up that the earth is actually millions of years old, and I am inclined to believe it. And the reason is this: if the angels had the capacity to come down and genetically modify human beings in a way that didn't cause them to just be born, freakish, death, disgusting, gross, broken, multiple limbs, the horrible things we see today from genetic mutations, we don't hear of that. The Nephilim were just described as the supermen, the men of old, the men of legend and lore, the giants, if you will. And by the way, the term giants comes from the Greek. It doesn't actually come from the original Hebrew. Nephilim is another way of saying the fallen ones, both describing the men who would destroy the earth and eventually get flooded and killed, men being genetically modified ones, of course, and the angels who came down and made the offer to the women, and they accepted, of course. So if we look in the description of the light bearer in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, so on, he's described as originally being the covering cherub. In other words, the primary angel in charge of defending God's creation against profanity, unholiness, stupidity, evil, etc. And this gets into another conversation about the gap between the first and the second verse of the Bible, which there's a significant one, which points to millions of years and the angels having had plenty of time to make their decision. The angels themselves are an eternal being, which means they're not just going to come to a decision directly right away to run against God, but I'm sure if they were given enough time and enough feelings of security because of that time that had passed, that perhaps they weren't going to be dealt with. And we all know that Satan was banking on God not judging him because he thought that God didn't want to destroy the family, but Satan didn't plan on man being made. So I attest, and I absolutely believe was the case, that the primordial earth, whether it had cavemen or not, I don't think we're genetically related to them, but whether it had cavemen or not, was certainly the earth was beautiful, covered in flora and fauna, probably a giant Pangea, a giant super nation in the middle of the waters, and was likely covered with all kinds of cool creatures. But what do we see in the New Testament when we see the angels who have basically completely lost their way, not just working against God and maintaining their form, but the ones that have kind of like lost it? They're always trying to invade bodies. They're always trying to feel. They're always trying to do anything they can, like the demoniac in Gadara, where he was, 7 demons. They were sent into the pigs and ran off the cliff to death. They were absolutely begging to maintain their physical perception. In other words, I think that it was part of the original sales plan of Satan to promise the angels some sort of sensation, the thing that they were not given, a body. I think that the initial rebellion was a gigantic genetic experiment on the world. I think the dinosaurs were a result of Satan playing games with the genome, much like he did with the Nephilim. And it would totally explain how in verse 2 you have a brooding, angry spirit of God looking over an entirely shapeless void of a water-covered earth. So in other words, Noah was not the first time the earth had been flooded. Whether it was, pounded with asteroids, meteors, sulfur burning from the heavens like they did in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's to be seen, but probably. No, the reason why I'm sure the earth is old and that the angels themselves have been around for many, 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 many millions of years. When we look in Job, it talks about the angels being present and celebrating at the creation of the earth. Well, it turns out that the verb that describes creation can also describe a recreation or a remaking. And if we look in the first verse of the Bible, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. So it's not like he made the angels first and then decided to leave that point out. He made everything all at once. Everything in the initial creation, before humans, before the angels destroyed the earth, was all made in one felled swoop. So for the angels to be rejoicing at the rebuilding of the earth required that it had to have been destroyed and judged and then started over again. And of course, anytime God acts, the angels that are with him are pro. Otherwise, they would have left him. They would have joined Satan and they would have jumped on the genetic modification bandwagon. So I also believe that's why Satan is called a dragon, because what is the only exposure man has had to dinosaurs if they've never been around while we are here on this earth? Well, it would have been bones. Gigantic, scary-looking, dragon-like bones. Big teeth, giant heads, like freakish things. And I don't think it's possible that they were just, not aware of it. They were excavating. They were moving dirt around. They were cultivating the earth. There's I'm sorry, very little chance, in my opinion, that they went on without at least seeing one dragon skull. We see them often, museums. Anyhow, all of this makes a lot of sense because, first off, the eternal nature of angels would mean that although they could, potentially come to the same decisions as us, they don't have the same restraints. So it would make sense that it would take them millions of years for the entire third that rebelled to officially join Satan. And it would also make sense that one of the greatest attacks against the Messiah would be to dilute his bloodline, or at least try to dilute his bloodline with something not genetically pure. And I also think the reason why the world destroyed itself so much was because the sin nature of man never left when the Nephilim were created. Just because they were huge and super and awesome and cool and all those things, supermen, whatever, doesn't mean that they weren't power sinners. They absolutely were. They were killing each other. They were doing violence throughout the earth. Remember Lamech talking about I'll be avenged 70 times? Like that notion is the type of people that went on to have relations with angels and superhumans. And Noah was not just called pure in his generation specifically because he was the last true believing patriarch of the time. It was also because he was likely the last genetically pure family. It's likely that Noah was born into a time when the Nephilim were popular everywhere and everybody had a choice to do it, but the conscience was held against them and they knew that it was wrong because they knew it was the angels that did it. It wasn't man. It wasn't God. So, also to address the later Israelites at one point call certain people, the Amalekites and whatnot, Nephilim because they're so tall and whatnot. But there are, 7+ foot tall people in the world today. So I think genetically speaking, the full spectrum of genetics is much greater than we probably think, and that quote unquote giants were not impossible even outside of the Nephilim. Because look at look at Goliath. He had multiple toes and fingers, and he was a genetic freak, and he had cousins that were genetic freaks that also had multiple fingers and toes that his men ended up killing off later on too. So it stands to reason that the genetic variation in the true human genome is quite large, but we are not supermen, and we certainly weren't genetically modified by angels outside of the Lord's will. So the Messiah was to maintain pure humanity, and I think that was the idea, was to try and trick people into wanting to be cool, be fancy. Same thing we do today. They want notoriety, they want clout. So the humans fell for a pretty gnarly trick that eventually led to the flood because of all the evil that was about the earth. And Noah wasn't just special because he was building a boat. He was special because he was genetically pure. He was genetically pure and faithful. Could God have saved a faithful Nephilim? Absolutely. But there's no indication that that ever happened. So that just shows you once humans in their sinful nature get enough power and prowess, they're going to completely reject him utterly. And that's part of the reason why the flood had to happen, was because the world was on its way to utter rejection. That's ever been Satan's goal, by the way. The ploy and the plot behind every single one of his attempts is always to divert humanity from finding God. He always fails, of course, because he never takes into consideration God's next step. But he doesn't know God, and he's not, he's not everywhere at once and aware of everything and knowing the complete plan front to back. Satan must really bank on God being a liar. So I'll also say this. A lot of people like to mention the days of Noah. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but in the days of Noah, Noah was like literally the last family of believers. So there are almost no believers left on earth. And everybody else that was on earth, although they had been watching him build that boat for 120 years before the rain started, they all sat there in utter rejection of the fact that the only holy person on earth that they all knew was with the true God was busy building a life raft, and they should have been running to him in mass. But instead, he probably took all kinds of abuse. He was probably persecuted like crazy, called insane, stolen from, lied to, cheated, all these things. All these things probably happened to him by the world at the time, but they were busy marrying and giving in marriage and doing business and all these things, thinking nothing was ever going to happen. And then one day, they were just done for. So the picture wasn't just that the time came on them like a trap. It actually came on them slowly and surely, and they were warned repeatedly, and there were very, very, very few faithful people left on the earth. So that particular picture actually points more towards the end of the tribulation than anything. That's the reason why Peter and Paul both kind of allude to the days of Noah as being very much like the end of the tribulation right before the Lord gets back. There will be very few believers. They will have very little social power. They will be warning those outside of them, and they will be ignored. And the mass majority of the world at the time not only will fall for the beast's machinations, his mark, and all that stuff, but they will be blissfully unaware of everything that's going on right up until the last minute. Then they're going to see that cross in the sky, and there's going to be fire, brimstone, and hell. I mean, he's even going to take out the remaining mark holders on the far coasts. He's very clear. There's nobody escaping this. If you got the mark, you're toast. That being said, there's also some indication there's going to be a few people that don't get the mark, but we'll see how that turns out. Anyway, the Nephilim is the pattern also for the Antichrist. That doesn't necessarily mean perhaps he'll be a giant and genetically modified in such a way, but something's coming that's like that. And it's not just going to be, it's not going to be the way that people think. And I mean that to believers as well, because the days of Noah that they're talking about is towards the end, and everybody's focusing on the beginning. And many of us are focused on not even being there, which is ridiculous. But see the other videos for that. I hope you guys have a great day. This was a really deep topic. This is highly misunderstood, and it totally makes sense as to why so many people misunderstand the age of the earth. Like, the Bible doesn't tell you how old it is, but it doesn't tell you that it's young. And it certainly doesn't tell you that the angels are young. But for some reason, we're supposed to think that the dinosaurs were around when David was here. That doesn't make sense. Anywho, you guys have a great day. Please comment away. Tell me how I'm wrong. I look forward to doing some word battle with you. Bless y'all. Have a good day.